Hey everybody, this is William Newsom with the Christendom curriculum. We're here today to talk about Christians against Christian nationalism. This is a new group that's come about, got their own website and a statement that a lot of people are signing. Now, the Christendom curriculum is the world's only Christian nationalist homeschool curriculum. So obviously this issue matters to us. And when someone says that Christian nationalism is somehow unchristian, well, that's something I want to read about and talk about. So we're going to look at their statement, see what they have to say, but just looking at the name, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, it strikes me as a little odd, as if it were saying Christians against Christian ethics or Christians against Christian morality or something, because nationalism merely means ideas about nations or nationhood. There is a nationalism, a doctrine of nations that we can derive from the scriptures, because from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible has a lot to say about the nations. It's very important, in fact, to our understanding of the Bible as a whole. So to say you're against Christian nationalism, well, that's a name, and maybe they're just reacting to certain ideas that they perceive as distortions of the scripture, perhaps. As we'll see, there's more than that going on, and I think it's not all entirely above board and honest, but let's look at the statement and see what it has to say. But first, an introduction. What do we mean by Christian nationalism? Now, I'm a Christian nationalist, so I want to tell you what I mean by it. These guys will tell you what they think it means, and we'll see if that matches up with an actual Christian nationalist. Christian nationalism is simply the idea that God created the nations, that it was his idea for mankind to be divided into various nations all over the world, that they were not to all be in one place with one language, with one culture. He likes, if I can use this word, diversity. He wants there to be a diversity of nations throughout the world. We see this in the Bible in a myriad of ways. We see also that in addition to him wanting to be there to be nations in the first place, he wants those nations to serve and glorify him. And of course, they're going to do that in their own unique cultural ways. If you look in God's words to Adam in Genesis, he tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. He never intended for Adam and his descendants to stay right there in the Garden of Eden. They were to go throughout the earth, replenish the whole earth. We see in Genesis 10 the same idea after Noah and his sons and their wives come out of the ark. Noah is kind of like a new Adam here. Just as we're all descended from Adam, we're all descended from Noah. And we're all descended from Noah's 3 sons. And in Genesis 10, we see that 70 nations came from Noah's 3 sons. There's more than 70 nations now, so all of them came from those 3 sons of Noah. And so these nations exist before Genesis chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. Here in the Tower of Babel, we see something very important. We see that man is resisting God's design for there to be many different nations with many different languages and many different cultures. I think it's pretty obvious that the fact that all the languages were confused at Babel and they all went out into those nations with different languages is something that would have happened organically over the course of centuries if man had obeyed God and gone out and formed different nations instead of existing as these separate nations but trying to put everybody under the same political machine. Nimrod and his cohorts at Babel were trying to do just that. They were resisting God's design for there to be a diversity of nations and a diversity of languages. So because of that, and because this was a consolidation of wickedness in a very, very great way that could have caused terrible things to happen, God acted. He is not going to allow that to go on. He is against globalist projects like the Tower of Babel, or we can say like the European Union or the United Nations. This idea that all the nations have to be under the same umbrella with the same rules is anti-biblical. So here at the very beginning of the Bible, we see a kind of nationalism in the idea that God creates the nations. And when man tries to force all the nations together in a sort of multicultural paradise, God acts to disrupt that. We see as the scriptures go on in various places, God talks about the nations. He talks about what he wants from the nations. In Psalm 2, we read, why do the nations rage and the peoples imagine a vain thing? And the nations are told, the kings of those nations are told, kiss the Son. That is the Son of God. Bow before your king. These nations need to be Christian, as we would say today. They need to be serving God as nations. Psalm 22 promises that just that sort of thing will happen when it says that all the peoples will remember and will return to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow before you. And so here we have yet another situation in the Bible where we have the description of nations serving and glorifying and worshiping and honoring God. We see this throughout the Bible in various ways. Israel was to be a light to the nations. They were to be the one nation, the holy nation, that acted as a priesthood to all the other nations. And sometimes they did that, but more often than not, they failed at being the light of the world. But Israel did serve God's purpose in bringing forth the Messiah, who would be the King of the nations. And so when Jesus comes and he gives his life for the sins of the world, and then he rises from the dead, what does he say before he ascends to take the kingship of the world and the ascension to the right hand of the Father? He says, go into the world and disciple the nations. In the book of Acts, Paul says in chapter 17, God made from one blood all the nations, and moreover, he set their boundaries of their habitations and the times for them to live there. Why? Paul says, because perhaps they might grope after him and find him. So nationalism, the idea that nations have their own boundaries, their own times, their own places to be, their own cultures and civilizations, is the very thing, according to Paul, that is a prerequisite for missions. It's a prerequisite for nations to be able to find the God who created them. The Bible virtually closes with a promise to the nations in the very last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 22, where we read that the leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations. So from the beginning to the end, we see there is a doctrine of nations in the Bible. Christian nationalism is simply trying to take these texts and understand them in a Christian and biblical way. We see that God made the nations. He wants there to be nations. This is not a bad thing. This is not a judgment for sin, as I've heard some Christians say. It was always the plan. And as John Piper points out in his book, Let the Nations Be Glad, this is something that carries on even after the end of history. Those national identities don't go away. They're a permanent part of the identity that God gave to the peoples that he put on this world. That's Christian nationalism. We believe that nations have a right to have borders. Those borders should be respected. We see when Moses and the children of Israel are going through a land that's not theirs, they ask permission of the king. He denies that permission. He says, you cannot come through, and if you do, I'll send my army out against you. So Moses and the people of Israel go another way. They respect those national borders. And God sets the borders for the land of Israel as well. So we have a whole book. Think about this. We have a whole book in the Bible, Nehemiah, that's entirely about creating, of all things, a border wall for the city of Jerusalem. But these globalists who are against Christian nationalism are going to tell us that all these things are somehow unchristian. Well, they don't think much of the Old Testament anyway. So a lot of that's going to be lost on them. But even in the New Testament, as we said, there are texts that talk about the nations and God's plan for the nations. So why then would there be Christians who are against Christian nationalism? It's mainly because as globalists, they don't want there to be national borders. They are also a part of a larger effort to undermine Christian and Western civilization, to take down the peoples that have historically built those nations, replace them with other peoples, replace them with other faiths. And so there's a lot going on here. But let's take a look at the statement, Christians against Christian nationalism, and see what we can make of it. The first part of it says, as Christians, our faith teaches us everyone is created in God's image and commands us to love one another. No problem there. We can all agree on that. Then they go on. As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Minor point here, not really relevant to our discussion, but America was not designed to be a democracy. If you look at what the founders had to say in the Federalist Papers and other places, they were very suspicious of democracy, and they gave us what they called a republic. But leave that aside for the moment. Today, the Christians Against Christian Nationalism say, we are concerned about a persistent threat to both our religious communities and our democracy, Christian nationalism. Well, we know that you don't like it. Why don't you like it? It says here, Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities. Here we got a problem, folks. There's, I dare say, not a single Christian nationalist who would recognize their beliefs in that statement. Christians seek to merge Christian and American identities. No, we don't. That would be a problem. We see that every person has a variety of identities. And the highest and the most important one of all for us as Christians is our Christian identity. How could anything matter more than the fact that we are the sons and daughters of God in Christ Jesus? Nothing matters more than that. That's our highest identity, our highest loyalty. That's what really matters. But God has also given us other identities, identities of family and of place, of nation and country, of ethnicity and race. All of these are part of God's design and God's handiwork in us. He's also made us male or female. That's a part of our identity, a secondary identity, not as important as our Christian identity, but still very important. Nobody's seeking to merge Christian and American identities. They say that this merging distorts both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Back to that again. Yeah, I think that would be a distortion of the Christian faith, but that's not what any of us believe. So I think that we have found here a real problem, because these are people who claim to be thought leaders in the Christian world, who claim to be well-read, who know what's going on and who have the pulse of the country enough to be able to issue a statement like that they expect thousands and thousands of people to sign. Well, here they've made a blatantly wrong statement. Is it because they're lying, or is it because they're just sloppy? Well, either way, it doesn't bode well for their statement. Christian nationalists do not seek to merge American and Christian identities. That's folly. That is wrong. Nobody believes that. They are driving their spears at a straw man here. But they go on, though. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state. Now, is that true? Here, I think I'll give it to them. I think they've got us. I think they've pegged us here. We do want Christianity to be privileged by the state. Maybe that's not the best way to put it, though, but we think that, as we said earlier, nations have a responsibility to God. Nations are bound to their creator just as human beings are. Nations are just peoples. Nations are not governments, by the way, but they include governments as part of their lives. But nations have a responsibility to the God who made the world. Christian nationalists have to say that they don't, that nations as nations or states as states are somehow exempt from God's requirements for the world. But that's not the case. As we've already seen in Psalm 2, the nations are called to honor the Son, to worship God. In Psalm 22, this is the case as well. In Acts 17, Paul says nations can grope after God and seek for him. So when we say that we want the Christian religion to be privileged by the state, we're saying only that the Christian faith is true and we want to live in a Christian country. This would have been utterly uncontroversial for almost the entirety of Christian history. This is not a strange statement that I'm making here. We want a Christian country, a Christian nation. We want our laws to reflect biblical values. We believe that God knows better than we do how to run a society. But these anti-Christian nationalists are at heart not Christians, but humanists. They believe humans can come up with a better plan for all this than God has given in his word when it comes to how to organize a society, what kind of laws to pass, and so on. They say here that Christian nationalism demands or implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. Is that true? Yes, I would say that's true also. They've got us pegged there. Some of these statements are accurate, but we're not making this up. It's not just an idea we came up with. Let me read to you a brief statement by John Witherspoon, an American clergyman and signer of the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon says this: "He is the best friend to American liberty who is the most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed enemy to God, I scruple not to call him an enemy to his country." He goes on to say this: "God grant that in America, true religion and civil liberty may be inseparable, and that the unjust attempts to destroy the one may in the issue tend to the support and establishment of both." So, according to Witherspoon, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding fathers, those who are enemies to the Christian religion are enemies to America. Now, again, we didn't make this idea up. You may disagree with it, but you can't say that it's somehow un-American when we're deriving this idea from the Bible and from one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Yes, we don't hesitate to say that the best Americans would be those who love Christ above all and want the best for their country because they're Christians. Christians can make mistakes. Christians can do terrible things, and sometimes we can be very bad citizens. But we do say that the best American would be one who is also a faithful Christian. They go on in this statement to say that Christian nationalism, and here, this is it. This is what they've been waiting for. I can see them drafting this statement and just salivating, waiting for the moment when they can make this one part of the statement. Here's what they say. Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. Well, that's it. They've pegged us. They've got us. That's what we really want. That's our secret desire. We want white people to rule all over the world and to have rule over the people of color of various nations. That's what we want. We want racial subjugation. We want to bring the blacks and the browns and everybody else back into slavery to us so we can sit on the porch with a mint julep while the cotton's being picked. That's it. They've got us. How did they figure us out? Somebody let our secret papers out, I guess. I don't know. Some leak to the press has happened here. Of course, this is not true, but this is exactly what the left does. This is exactly what our enemies do. They have one card in their deck that they love to play, and that's the race card. They have one trick in their bag of tricks, and it's trying to deceive people into thinking that everybody that disagrees with them is a racist, is a anti-Semite, is a homophobe, is a bigot of some sort. This is what they do. This is how they play the game. And so it didn't take long for them to get to this here. But we would just add here that Christian nationalism in no way requires some kind of hatred of other races or people that are of other nations. Indeed, we want the same blessings for all nations that we want for ourselves. We believe that under God, when a nation submits itself to Christ and his word, they will be blessed. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. We want those blessings for everyone. We don't want anyone to miss out. So we don't hate anybody. But the thing is, it doesn't matter anymore. Racism is just the thing they say. But although they've backed off from that a little bit, now it's more white supremacist or white nationalist. That's the thing that they're going for now. But it's all the same thing. It's all part of the same cultural Marxist bag of tricks whereby we undermine European and Christian societies by driving a wedge between majority and minority populations, make them hate each other. And we are always talking about oppressed peoples and the oppressor at the top of the chain. By doing that, they keep the revolution alive because these people are Marxists at heart. They want the revolution. They want the overthrow of Christian civilization. That's the one thing they cannot stand. They cannot stand the thought of a Christian civilization. And that's something we had for more than a millennium. It's over now, but it's going to come back. I believe it's really this is just a temporary setback. The Bible tends to teach that that the Great Commission will be fulfilled and the nations will turn, as we've already read in Psalm 22. So Christian nationalism can't be defeated. It can experience setbacks, but it can't be defeated. But again, this is just their way of silencing all opposition. Call your enemies racists. Call them something along those lines. It's cultural Marxism. And I think probably the best way to beat that is by simply not caring. Let them call you a racist. Maybe you are by their definition, you are a racist if you're white, because that's what they say. You can look at the scholars since the 80s, at least, this has been said, that it is only the majority population that can be racist. The minorities can't. It's not about hating people. It's about being in either the oppressor class or the oppressed class. And wherever you fall, your skin is your uniform, and that tells you whether you're a racist or not. So at this point, it makes no more sense for a white man to deny that he's a racist because, after all, I don't hate people because of their race, than it would be for a straight man to say, I'm gay because I feel happy. No. The word has changed meaning. The culture has turned the corner. It's time to move on. It's time to admit it. Embrace your inner racist, I guess. The statement goes on. Let's see. We reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. Whoa, threat to the nation. They have a nation, I guess. Having a nation is not bad. It's just wanting your nation to be Christian that's a problem, I guess. They go on to say, as Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship. Not really true. The Bible does talk about our heavenly citizenship. But by faith, they say, we believe that, and then we've got a list of bullet points here. We believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. I would disagree with that as a Christian nationalist. So here, I think they've pegged an issue that really does matter to some extent. But I think that they're hypocrites here, because suppose that a bunch of Christians moved to an Islamic nation and started engaging constructively in the public square there to change the Sharia law and to make it into a more Christian law. Do you think these leftist-globalist Tony Campolo types would have a problem with that? You bet they would. They wouldn't like that at all, but they're perfectly fine with people of all faiths or no faith changing the laws in historically Christian nations. They go on to say, we believe that patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. Well, unless your religious conviction is that Christian nationalism is right and proper and good, and nations should be Christian, if that's your religious conviction, you probably should minimize it, or else you're not really a patriot, because then you're a threat to our democracy, as they've already told us. We believe that one's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Here again, we're living in a place where, in time, where this is the truth, where people of all faiths can participate in the process. But historically, we've had nations that were Christian, that were even Protestant or Catholic. We've had Islamic nations. We still do. We still have Christian nations today. You don't force anyone to be baptized or to believe something they don't believe or to make a statement of faith. But in the Bible, people who came to Israel for sanctuary were required, as one theologian put it, to break their idols at the gates. They could not openly practice their religion in Israel. And in point of fact, if they were seen to be subverting the faith of Yahweh in Israel, they were subject to the death penalty, as were native Israelites. You couldn't do that. So biblically, one's religious affiliation or lack thereof was important, and I think it should be again, and I think it will be again. We believe that government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Well, this is where they tell us flat out that they're not Christians. Okay, they may be baptized Christians, and that's important. I'm not saying that's unimportant at all, but government should not prefer one religion over another. What these people, focus on this. What these people believe is that Jesus Christ should not, must not be honored in the public square. That's what it's really all about. They don't want the name of Christ to be honored in the public square. In government, in our laws, in any way, shape, or form, you must not honor Christ. Let that sink in. If Donald Trump or some other politician in Washington were to say, you know what, I'm convicted that as a Christian in a nation that is majority Christian still, we ought to honor Jesus Christ in the civic realm, in the public square in various ways. These leftist globalists would have a cow. They would not care for that at all. And I think this is what it comes down to. This is a group of people that professes a kind of Christian religion, a kind of allegiance to Jesus, but they've become so entangled in false doctrine that they have literally come to a place where they insist that Christ not be honored. They say here, we believe religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. I have no idea who this is aimed at. I've never heard of anyone saying that that this is best done by the government. Maybe it's a reference to people wanting prayer in public schools or something. I don't know. But for Christian nationalists, we tend to be very much against government education of all sorts. So no, we don't want we don't want religious instructions in the public schools, because we don't want religious instruction to be anywhere but the family, and because in the church, of course, and we don't want public schools to exist at all. So I have no idea who they're really aiming this at, if not that, but it's not a tenet of Christian nationalism to want religious instruction to be done by the government. We believe, they say, that America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Well, again, unless your theological conviction is Christian nationalism, in which case you're going to have to sacrifice it according to these guys, or you're not going to be living in civic harmony. I mean, this is hypocrisy. And America's historic commitment to religious pluralism is a lie. It's not true historically. At the time, we have the First Amendment that prohibits Congress from establishing a state Christian religion or a denomination at that level. But at the time of the Constitution's ratification, as Doug Wilson and others have pointed out, 9 out of the 13 states had state Christian religions, and nobody lost their lunch over it. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't considered to be a problem for the First Amendment at all. We have and always we are and always have been a Christian nation. That doesn't mean that every aspect of our government was specifically Christian, and there are some ways I think they should have done it differently. More important is we're not now a Christian nation, but we need to be. We need to be a Christian nation, and we need to get busy with the work of making that so. A couple more points they have here. We believe that conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. It's a straw man again. Christian nationalists do not conflate religious authority with political authority. We believe there is a difference between the state and the church. And if these leftist globalists like that distinction, well, you're welcome, because it was men of Christendom. It was Puritans and Calvinists and other horrible creatures like that that gave that idea to the world. So you're welcome. We don't conflate religious authority with political authority. That would be or could be idolatrous. But here again, they throw in the cultural Marxism. It leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups. There we go again. Trying to drive a wedge and create tension. These globalists are using minority groups as their proxy warriors to take out the Christians, to take out the European societies that have been based on Christian belief for many hundreds of years. Their final bullet point here, we must stand up to speak. and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship against religious communities at home and abroad. Probably a reference to the recent synagogue shooting in Poway, but we don't know for sure. They don't mention anything specifically, and you know they're not they can't really pin anyone who's a Christian nationalist with an act of violence. There's plenty of violence going on the left. Of course, on Easter Sunday, hundreds of Christians were massacred in Sri Lanka. I wonder if these leftist globalists have much to say about that. They seem to care more about violence when it comes from the right than from the left. But we'll let them speak to that. I think their final statement they make here in the last paragraph: whether we worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, America has no second-class faiths. Well, we are pluralistic now, and so that statement's true as far as it goes, but that in reality there are second-class faiths. The first-class faith would be the one that happens to be true, and these guys claim to be Christians. Therefore, theoretically, they believe that the Christian faith is true. If they believe it's true, then it should be the first-class faith. And again, why would a society as a society, or a nation as a nation, not want to acknowledge the Son of God? That's what it comes down to. They go on to say, all are equal under the U.S. Constitution. As Christians, we must speak in one voice, condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. These Christians insist that you do not dare to honor Jesus Christ. If you're a politician, if you're serving America in a civic square in some kind of role as a magistrate, whether you're a mayor of a town, a senator, a president, whatever you may be, don't you dare honor Jesus Christ in your role as civic magistrate. Christ must be kept out of the public square. You can talk about him on your own, but he doesn't belong here. That's what this is all about. That's what these people believe, but they will not be honest enough to say it in so many words. Globalism is a threat to Christendom, the historic rule of Christ over the nations that has been manifest most clearly, not exclusively, but most clearly in the European nations. Christendom, the rule of Christ over the nations. And these people hate it. They despise it. They want to overturn it and overthrow it, as all globalists do. Christian nationalism is the answer to globalism, theologically and politically. That's why we created the Christendom curriculum, which, as I said before, is the only homeschool curriculum that is specifically committed to Christian nationalism. So if you want your kids to have a different view on this, if you want them to be able to steer clear of the political correctness and the multiculturalism, without hating anyone that's different, without disparaging people of other nations or even of other faiths, though we disagree with them, but still loving their own nation, believing that their own nation has a right to their sovereign borders, has a right to be defined as a nation of America or of Japan or of Israel or of Nigeria or whatever nation, and to remain as they are and to guard and police their borders. And if you believe that a nation has a right to be Christian, and you want your children to be able to grow up and know how to fight the culture wars and win, then the Christendom curriculum may be just what you're looking for. Look in the notes below this video, or you can go to christendomcurriculum.com to learn more. We have a video there. We have lots of information on the Learn More page. Join us. You'll be starting in a tremendous adventure for your kids, learning what they're not going to learn really in any other curriculum besides the Christendom curriculum. So check it out, christendomcurriculum.com. That's all for today. I appreciate you joining us. Subscribe to the channel, click like, and share this video. We'd really appreciate it. Have a great day.